So 6 years ago, I wrote a book on on the street, which came out of my dissertation work from many years before that. And Peter somehow got his hands on this book and invited me to the first and then second of the Future of Public Place conferences. I'd been writing about streets before that and after that, and I think for the last couple years, Peter and Tigran said, you should just talk about the street. You should be the street talking person for us. And I said, okay, I can do that. And so if you notice one of the earlier programs that Tigran sent us, he had already decided what I was going to talk about, which was the second paper down there, which is Revisiting Lively Streets, Social Interactions in Public Space. That had already been published, and I figured I'm not going to be able to recook that or rehash it for another publication, especially because it's peer-reviewed, published in JPER. To add to that complication, it was a paper that was published as a longitudinal study, second paper, of the first paper, which was published in 2007. And why I'm telling you this story is because this talk is not going to be about the street or anything about streets. But the first paper I published, which was about looking at neighborhood main streets and trying to find out what are the factors, both design, management, and any other planning aspects, that support social behavior. So that was a simple question that led to the first paper. That was done in 2005, and some of you may have seen it, so I didn't want to bore you through that. While I was working at the University of South Florida, I had a good friend who was a professor of psychology, and she was interested in the work I did. That was not her research area, but she liked what I did, so we would chat, and about 8 years later, I got some money to redo the research on the same streets in the Boston metropolitan area. And while I was talking to her, she said, why are you wasting your time? She said, all of you urban designers and planners, the closest you go to anything is correlations. And what does that tell anybody? She says, you need to talk about causality. And he says, whoa, we can't do that. We'd never do it, and I'm not a statistical sort of person. I know a little bit about it, I meddle in it, factor analysis, little bit of regression analysis, but I'm not a methodologist in that sense. And nobody talks about causation. You want to stay away from that. So she said, okay, do the longitudinal study and come to me. I said, all right, good. We had already written a paper together on third places earlier, and so I said, I'll let you do the statistical heavyweight lifting on it. And what she said is that if you use again, I don't want to go into the statistical jargon too much, if you use your time one study, T1, as a variable, we can see how your T2 tests against it. So anyway, we did all of that, and we published this in a repeat paper after 8 years or so. So I didn't want to bore you about that, but there's a parallel research or study that I've been working on for a while, and I thought this would be a good opportunity to start spending some time on that. So in the program, the other thing I noticed, aside from the fact that I had already been assigned this talk that I was going to give, this quote that Tigran put in from Kubrick. And I don't know if Kubrick ever said that or not, but I thought it would be pretty useful, that what I'm going to do here is something that's already been done, and the attempt is to try to tease out something about public space as we move forward. So bear with me, this is something that is sort of just cooking, and I'd like to hopefully have a word with many of you to see how we get to do this a little better. So I've lived in Cincinnati for about 5 years. It's a small by population, very small, 300,000 people, Midwestern city, but very, very charming, a pre-Chicago city where the Ohio River led to Cincinnati and made this a really wonderful, charming place. What you see here in this slide is a very typical, a nice park in the center city gets renovated, probably some public-private partnership happening here. They've got a nice, wonderful $20 million underground garage, and the space is celebrated, and it's been in papers and all the blogs and the whole deal. On the right here is Music Hall, which is again a wonderful institution. So the people who do this is an organization which is called 3CDC. It's a development corporation, but it's a non-profit. It was set up by the biggest businesses in town when they said it is basically you need to do something about the center city or we are going to be dead. And so they formed this organization, pumped it with money, essentially started a 20-year process of gentrification in the area. That's playing out with many things, good and bad. We have a streetcar now, even though our mayor, that is a Democratic mayor, is completely against the streetcar. Anyway, so a lot of the alumni from the School of Planning work in 3CDC. And this is another picture of it. And the space has this common oval. There is a beer garden that was put in later. There is a dog park, kids play area, so on and so forth. So the conversation started with this one silly thing, the canopy that you see on the upper photograph. This was a makeshift canopy that they put on top of the beer garden. And one of the sort of head honchos in 3CDC came to us because he would come to reviews and student crits and all of that, said, look, can you guys give us a solution for this? We don't really know what to do. This looks really ugly, and it looks really, really makeshift. This canopy, we don't know what to do with it. So we said, yeah, I think that the canopy is only a small aesthetic problem. There are probably some larger problems here. I won't get into this whole Washington Park being a sort of a cousin of Bryant Park in New York, the same phenomena happening, that they drove the people that were drinking in the park and replaced it with a place that is a beer garden that you buy beer and drink in the park. And a lot of people obviously critique that and see it quite blatantly. So we said, I think there is other things that are going on where you see this park as a very inclusive park for everyone. Perhaps there's more things in it. So we figured, how might we assess this park, forget the canopy, but assess the park. So of course there's tens of measures which are very, very well crafted in the literature on public space, and we said we could actually do by using some of these. So we did a study over several months, part of a public space class I teach, and we looked at all kinds of things. This is just one slide that shows the distribution of race. We ran it through some slightly sophisticated GIS tools that start to tease out densities where people are really grouping or not, and we started to find some ideas about where are the places of integration. Cincinnati is a 45-55 black-white city. Asians like me they don't live in the city. I do, but mostly everybody lives in the suburbs. So those were the only two races that were essentially in the area anyway. There's nothing wrong with a public space of this size that has people in adjacent occupancy. As a lot of public space literature would tell you, that people don't have to be sharing the exact same space. Even if they are adjacent, that is in fact a place of bridging. But what we found was particularly unusual was that was these places here. That these were distinct places that were also enclosed somewhat, and that were really, really segregated by race. So we said, you've essentially taken out all of the African American population that you called winos and drug addicts, and now you are selling beer to essentially white population. Something is not right, and we need to essentially look at this as a larger thing that is happening in the neighborhood and then in the city. So we had already been doing this work, and when I started thinking about what this talk could be, I figured we might actually integrate some of that work into trying to find how to study and appraise public space, not on a generalized basis, but rather on a little bit more specific basis that is typology-led. So here's a map of sort of the center city and a couple neighborhoods that are just north of the center city, and students of mine were doing research around these spaces. It's really environment behavior research. You go there, you observe, and you have maps, and you interview, and so on and so forth. So Cincinnati, like any other city, any other at least large city, this small city has a plethora of very, very wonderful, varied spaces. You know, some really image kind of symbolic spaces like these, to ordinary places like this, to large parks, restorative places of community gathering, to neighborhood places that you might expect in any city. So there's a whole range. The point of these slides is that even though this is a small city by population, most of those things that happen that you might see in New York or London, as we are seeing today, play out here to some extent. And we know from literature, on the left is the 1992 work that Carr and Rivlin, Stone, and Francis did by developing a very loose typology, and on the right is a much, much more robust typology that Matthew Carmona developed more recently. The purpose of this is to explain that public space itself has this range by which it is created, managed, and used. So we were looking at all these types that existed in the area that we were studying and trying to actually come up with a sort of a composite assessment of this. This is work done by students, and we created these tools where you could think about pouring something in. So rather than putting hard numbers, they would put numbers in, but then we would make this much, much more visual, that we would actually take a slider and people would be able to slide and talk about whether this place is more, is it tighter or looser, taking those definitions, or how much of the ownership do people sense in this space, or how civil, based on what you see, is this public space. So these are loose measures. They're not particularly precise, but they're meant to be that. And it shows that we are trying to understand all these spaces. The difficulty that we had at that time, and this is the kind of the heart of this talk, is these measures that we were using that were really, really good, well thought out, well written measures were not fitting neatly with the desired outcomes of public spaces, because the outcomes of public spaces would be different depending on what public space it would be. So, and I'll try to tease this out a little bit. So I want to go back to the larger idea of public space, P capital, S capital. Here I have a couple quotes from Seta and Neil Smith, which essentially talk about the connection of public space, the geography of this, to public sphere. The fact that this is sort of a representation of what is happening in the public sphere, and there is no question about that. I think the part that I wanted to look at is that, is every public space the same, and can it be tested by the same measures? Or have measures, do measures need to be calibrated or selected to look at these public spaces? So again, just to reiterate, we are on board that space is political and public space is political, every public space. However, when we look at the classification, again done by, in theory, the classification of public space itself talks about aspects that are social, symbolic, political, places of everyday and places of meaning, ceremonial, community, so on and so forth. So the classification itself is gets into little details of what kind of public space it is, and the measures are far more nuanced, and they are very, very, very detailed. There are measures here from, I have included SETA's measures as well. I have a piece in here that's mine. Ali's measures are in here as well, access, agency, and interest. So these are really thought out measures of public space. And the question then is this relationship between the way we classify it and the way we measure it. Right now we are using all the measures to assess any public space. We're not particularly tailoring it to the basis of what is the outcome of this public space. So what would be the benefit to planning and design action if this is only talked about as P capital, S capital sort of public space? So this is, my attempt here is not to water down or sort of create a new classification, but I just took all of the classifications that we know and put them into 4 categories just for ease. So there's a category of social and convivial space, restorative space, display and image, symbolic space, and political and democratic space. These are not mutually exclusive. So a space can be all 4, it can be 2 of those, so on and so forth. And of course, the range of spaces falls into these shades of gray, pun intended. So what I started to do, and I wanted to have some fun with this, is to look at the areas we know. This is the area of that Washington Park, and I'm not an artist, but I figured watercolor is a really good medium when you're talking about fuzzy things, that you want to just play with it and try and get your hands dirty, if you will, because it is easy to mend, easy to remove, easy to do things with it. And we started to sort of overlay the same area, these 4 colors. So I'll stop here for a minute. The blue here starts to represent what the city and the private-public sort of interest is using, what kind of spaces as symbols to sell the place. What is going on in the Chamber of Commerce? What is going on in your write-ups about Cincinnati does this, the other? It's sort of the next thing that you should bring the Amazon headquarters to. So at the end of the day, the idea is to take this area and put all these colors in it to understand the space in what is its sort of prime component in terms of its classification. After we did that, I said, why not take the whole neighborhood, over the Rhine, which is this neighborhood that is gentrifying, and start to actually put these colors in it and start to understand what is restorative space, what is social space, what is symbolic, and where does political activity take place? Where is it even appropriate for political activity to take place? That doesn't mean that the political activity has to take place only in front of City Hall. It can take place in the neighborhood plaza, because getting a signature about an issue is political activity, and we record that. And we sort of crowdsourced this through the classes I was teaching over the few years and a couple of other professors. We looked at articles that are in the paper and tried to find the spaces. And we have a pretty good knowledge of this area. We've been studying it for years. And then, not to bore you through all the steps, this is the area of the city all the way downtown up that you can actually start to color it with some of these. Again, this is not something that is precise, but it is an attempt to understand what happens in what space, and can we then use the same methods of appraisal or the same measures in every space. So then what I started to do was to say, okay, what are the values that we, in the literature, people who write about public space, would want to assign to a particular type of public space? what would be the criteria and what would be the desired outcomes? What would you like to see in a beloved public sort of park like the one I showed you, that it would need to be inclusive, diverse, open, very well connected, so on and so forth. So here's a quick run on 3 spaces. This is the same one, Washington Park. And I use the same list of, or about the same list of classification and the measures. And with some hesitation, it is easy to start to create hierarchies, that certain things are actually more important in a particular space while others are less important. So you might think that that is based a lot on individual perception or group perception. Yes, it is. However, there are ways that you can still assign certain values and certain sort of expectations from certain spaces. So one would expect that this space would be symbolic, political, liberal, social, ceremonial, enjoyable. The criteria would mean that it's highly accessible, connected, communicative, inclusive, and managed. And the outcomes is that this is democratic. Do you actually see people being able to have a rally here? It's civil, and there is intersubjectivity in Cohn's words, where people are actually interacting with others, unlike themselves. There is agency, and there's sociability, pleasurability. Again, it's not an exhaustive list, but the idea here is that you can actually tease out that not everything is the responsibility of every public space. Taking another one, a neighborhood plaza in my neighborhood, it's very easy to say that certain things are not expected of this, while other things are the key things that are expected of the space. And then there is a way to begin to tease it out, that a neighborhood public space doesn't need to be connected the same way that the city public space needs to be. In fact, if that's what's happened to it, it actually loses certain things about it. There is a certain ownership of the neighborhood that is required for it. Doesn't mean that is exclusive. It is not gated. It is completely open, but it does not require you to connect the most common sort of transportation network to that space. That is not the responsibility for that space. And so, this is social, ceremonial, enjoyable, it's locally accessible, communicative, communitarian, there should be intersubjectivity, agency, sociability, so on and so forth. And finally, the last one that kind of also teases out the differences is urban woods. We have a 90-acre park, and we have 7 or 8 of those. We don't expect it to be many, many things. This is not where a political rally ever happens. People might rally if this space was going to be given to a developer, and people might camp outside and say, do not take Burnett Woods away and sell it to a developer. People might tie themselves to trees, yes, but it is not the base expectation from a 90-acre woods for it to be the place of political rally. Now, anything can change, depends on what happens, but that is not the first expectation for it. And hence, the measures become different. You want to think about, let's pick something that is challenging, tolerance of difference. Nobody in this room would disagree that if a park of that size should be a place where there is tolerance for difference. I don't think that is contested, but that is not the priority. There is agency, there is all kinds of other things that are the key priority for this space. And so, teasing this out, if you think about it, the major thing for this space would be that it's restorative, and it's enjoyable, and so on and so forth, yet it's accessible, connected, inclusive, managed. Again, these are not things that are finalized, but it is just to pose this question that there is no way to measure any public space and all public spaces by the same method, that we need to really tease out what are the measures for these spaces. So the ideal public space, P capital, S capital, is obviously utopic. We know that. That should be the ideal that we should look toward. The Agora was not the ideal public space, we all know. There was exclusion in the Agora. There was exclusion in the Maidan. Any public space we know is almost not fully it's not ideal in the sense that we would like it to be. But focusing on outcomes in specific types of public spaces and the expectations might actually help us get to some of the goals of public space. Thank you.